Hi, my name's Alex Colopy. I'm here speaking today with Dr. Federico Waitoller about his newest book, Excluded by Choice, Urban Students with Disabilities in the Education Marketplace. This was published this year with Teacher College Press. Dr. Waitoller is a former elementary and preschool teacher. He's now an associate professor of special education at the College of Education at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in special education with a focus on the intersections of disability, race, ethnicity, class, and gender. His new book adds to his already tremendous scholarship around equity and inclusive education with a critical focus on intersectionality, culturally sustaining practices, and problems around charter schools and choice. Welcome, Dr. Waitoller. I'm hoping that you can first speak to us about the impetus for this book. Why is this important now, especially for administrators, practitioners, and teachers?
Yeah, thank you. First, thank you for inviting me to be here in your sort of podcast, videocast. So the impetus, I think there's a couple of reasons that pushed me to write this book. One of them is when you see the literature and the research on school choice and charter schools, what you see is mostly the debates are on quantifiable terms. And what I mean by that, I mean, most of the debates are charter schools or school choice programs producing better test scores, or are graduating students at higher rates than neighborhood schools, or they're providing more college access. And I see very little of actually people's experiences through these policies. So the book has a big emphasis on people's life, people's experiences, mostly students and their parents. And it gives like flesh and blood and a lot of emotion to all these policies that we have this macro debate without thinking about real people's life and how they affect them. So I think that was one of the impetus. The second one was that when I also see the debates, the research, the literature on charter schools and school choice, you see that those debates dichotomize the issue. And what I mean by that is they either talk about students, usually in terms of from racial minority backgrounds, Black students, Latino students, and how they're affected by school choice, charter schools, or students with disabilities. And there was very little literature and research and debate that really takes in consideration how both race and disability shapes the experiences of students, or Latinx and Black students with disabilities, and other students with disabilities as well. So I wanted to bring that lens, to foreground that lens, that students don't come just with one layer of difference to schools, or don't experience school in just simple terms, or in unitarian terms, in a sense that just on basis of their race, or just basis on their disability, but actually they experience very school life in very complex ways, because these complex layers that they bring with them to school, and of course because the racism and ableisms that they experience in everyday school. And I think this is very important. I mean, I was thinking about that question, and I think it took a different significance this year, I think, with all the activism on police brutality, for example, and all the exciting movements that are going on now in the US to produce some real change around this issue. The book is not about police brutality, but the book does talk about disciplinary, exaggerated and punitive disciplinary measures that many of these charter schools are implementing with students with disabilities, which are, I think, very close to the kind of ideology and practices that brings police brutality to Black and Latinx communities.
I'm glad that you brought this up, especially because I think that that's a reason that students as pre-service teachers are drawn to wanting to learn more right now. Even over the summer now, I've had students who will be K through 6 teachers reach out to me and ask, what can I do? What does this mean for me in the classroom? And as I mentioned to you, one of the reasons that we've started this series is to make these ideas more accessible to students. And one of the things that students have been drawn to in the news recently and in podcasts are podcasts and episodes about school segregation. But as you pointed out, much of those only focus on race or only focus on disability. So I appreciate you sharing that meaning for teachers now. So the context where you did your research, which my understanding is this is around where you live and work, outside of Chicago. Yeah. Can you speak to, I'm sorry?
Inside Chicago.
Can you speak to what this urban context means? Why is it important, this specific context inside of Chicago?
Yeah, American cities have a very deep history of racial segregation, as you may know, and your students may know. And Chicago is absolutely not exempt of that history. And I wanted to situate the story of the students within that developing historical racial segregation, and how their experiences are not just shaped because they're due to race or disability or the race of disability, but also in the geographical location in the city. So students who lived in areas in where has a much deeper history of racial segregation and racial tension had different experiences even than those Black and Latinx families living in middle class areas of the city. And to understand that, we need to understand not just the history of racial segregation in Chicago that I show on the book with maps and with different historical events, but also what happened more recently in the 2000s and how the city has been reshaping itself, like many other cities, like earlier New York and Seattle and other cities that have been what is called renewal of the city, which basically means gentrification and displacing Black and Latinx or other minority communities more and more away from the city. And I went to place and I show in the book how these patterns of racial segregation, coupled with how city has invested their funds to promote this city renewal, has shaped also the experiences of Black and Latinx families with school choice, particularly those families who have students with disabilities. So the book has a profound focus on the geography of the city and the history of those geographies. So I thought it was very important to localize those stories on those larger historical events that have been occurring.
So it sounds like what you're saying, this renewal, that it was perhaps well-meaning attempts to improve schools. Am I understanding that correctly? That there were consequences to that?
There are definitely consequences. There is an entire chapter on consequences. But yes, I mean, these new ways to improve urban districts comes as well-intended, comes as trying to help these areas of the city that have been abandoned over time. But their approaches are highly paternalistic and punitive, and they come from a deficit view of these communities and students with disabilities.
So, and you've touched on this a bit, but rather than looking at race or disability separately, for example, you frame racism and ableism as interconnected structures of oppression, and that affect the school experiences of families, as you describe in the book, that you feature in the book. And I'm hoping that you can explain for me in sort of plain language what you mean by ableism and what you mean by intersectionality.
Yeah, ableism is a series of beliefs, ideologies, and practices that discriminates against people with disabilities. In basic terms, I mean, I can make more deeper theoretical debate about this, but in basic terms, ableism, it's about practices, structures, ideologies that discriminate against people with disabilities, that try to puts a hierarchy of in human life on who is worth as a human or not in terms of their abilities. So intersectionality is when those practices and ideologies based on ableism intersects and interact with those based on racism. So, for example, in the book, particularly the first two chapters, or chapter 2 and chapter 3, talks about how families, Black and Latinx families of students with disabilities, experience school choice amid these intersections of ableism and racism. And for example, explain how their experiences are shaped by the history of racial segregation, by a history of austerity measures that also had defund services for students with disabilities, by deficit views about students with disabilities and Black communities and Latinx communities, and by lack of resources for many of the schools serving these students, and of course by racial and ability segregation. So all these layers in where structures around ableism and racism interact and shape the experiences of these families with school choice programs. And we need to see those interactions to really understand why these families experience and school choice programs in these particular ways.
So you mentioned a lot about how this is historical and this is a matter of systemic changes and where funding goes. And so I'm wondering how this affects teachers on the ground to have an understanding of this, but you've also written elsewhere about building an intersectional approach at the school level. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to that. What's a teacher to do with this knowledge?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's the $1 million question. So I have some attempts to answer it. And yes, I have written about this. The book has the final chapter of the book. It's all about these very concrete recommendations that from policymakers to teachers and administrators. And for teachers' sake, they need to anchor their practices in anti-racist, but also anti-ableist and inclusive practices. So, for example, all the work, the long development of what we call cultural responsive pedagogies, the cultural sustaining pedagogies, we need to begin to cross-pollinate and merge them with all this large tradition of building inclusive practices. That I'm not talking just about differentiation, but actually transforming the general education classroom in a way that all forms of being are being valued, respected, and are used as valuable ways to learn and be in the classroom. And if we separate both or we don't implement them, I think it has consequences for the kind of experiences we're giving to all students, not just Black and Latinx or other students with disabilities. There's a long tradition in inclusive education with universal design for learning, for example, which I think it's limited, and that's the reason I think it needs to be cross-pollinated and expanded with an anti-racist and cultural sustained curriculum, and vice versa. And one of the things that we need to start talking about in school within this intersectional pedagogy, it's about disability as content, and not just talking about disability as trying to understand, what it matters to be a student with autism, or let's get to know more a student with X or Y disability, but actually talking about the history of disability and how our institutions operate in certain ways that discriminate and marginalizes people with disabilities, and also disable certain people for the kind of institutional arrangements and practices that are being afforded to students.
I appreciate how explicit you are in the fact that practices can disable students. And so this is a shift from perhaps a textbook that a pre-service teacher might receive that explains how to include the children who have already been identified as different, like that differentiation practices or cooperative learning, to the cross-pollinating practices that you suggest.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, let me say something, because there's something that I say and I think I need to correct myself. I think it's a little tricky because we do have social arrangements that because they are illicit and privilege certain abilities, they ended up discriminating certain students. But there's a problem also calling that disabling students, because then disability takes a negative term. And for many people with disabilities is not a negative thing, but it's part of their identity and something to be proud of. So I think there's a tension there between those views of disabilities, and I think we need to put that forward and acknowledge that.
Thank you for adding that. And there also, I think, underlying or implicit in that statement is privileging folks' experiences and ideas and feelings around the way that they identify and are positioned by and experience school systems. And you mentioned that bit about what really makes this book unique, at the beginning of our talk, around featuring folks' stories, featuring families, children, teachers' experiences specifically in this context. And as I was reading your book, I was really struck by how much feelings come up. There's a lot of discussion of words like frustration or anger. Parents refer to a child as my baby, or express sadness around their situations in schools. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that at all. There's this increasingly corporate managerial discussion around charter schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great observation. I haven't thought about that. The juxtaposition between the managerial discourse about students and actually parents' talks and families' talks about students, which are very different. The managerial, I think, corporate and charter school administration terms, these students were a problem. They were something to be managed. They were numbers. For parents, they're their babies, they're their love, the most precious thing in their life. And they're going through school, having one after another bad experience, not just with charter schools, but with all the private neighborhood schools they attended as well. And there is frustration, but there is also hope, because there is also something new that may change things. And parents keep dealing with that dance, with that tension between constant frustration, desperation, but also hope, because they're also hoping that the next move, their next school move, will be better. And some of them even stay, even within, even experiences very detrimental experiences, detrimental practices for their children. They ended up staying still in those circumstances, hoping that things will improve. So I think their book is very emotional. It was also very emotional to write it and hear these stories from parents and try to write them in a respectful and truthful way. But also there is a lot of emotion. I think in the foreword, Alfredo Ortigler says there is a lot of emotion in the air. And I think the book, it's very unique in that sense.
My final question for you actually was about hope for the system in general. You pose this question, you say, can charter schools reclaim their original aspiration and become a catalyst for educational equity? Can they be leveraged to move toward a radical and transformative inclusive education? So can it happen?
That's a good question. I provide a lot of recommendations for that to happen. It demands a lot of change. It demands a lot of structural change. Our current structure of charter schools, mostly newer centers, belongs to these huge corporate networks that comes to neighborhoods with histories of racial segregation and abandonment from city government to become these saviors that comes to help these people. But it comes from a very top-down managerial corporate form, and that brings a lot of tensions that I explore in the book. The argument that I bring in the book, if that needs to change, charter schools needs to be not corporate or network-based, but actually needs to be community-based and be emerged from the community needs and community stakeholders. And that should include students as well. And when you see the origins of charter schools were based on giving more flexibility to communities and teachers and students and parents, so they can be a little freedom from bureaucracies and try to innovate, was not thought as these larger corporate networks that we have today. And I think that structure needs to change. I think punitive practices need to stop immediately in charter school. But there is a tension, and there's a problem with that. And that's what I'm a little pessimist, because many of these charter schools build their reputation in those practices. So finishing those practices will mean to change their market identity within the educational market, because that's how they market themselves. They market themselves as highly competitive and strict, and they sell themselves as this disciplinary force in these neighborhoods that are being discursively constructed as unruly. So destroying this that kind of marketing strategy kind of dissolve the soul of this corporate and charter school network. So I see it very difficult, but I think it could happen if, from a policy approach, we begin to change the ways that we approve and we renew certain charter contracts.
Thank you for leaving us with that hope. I think it's both hopeful for those working within the system as well as educational scholars who are looking to learn more about the charter system. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate hearing from you.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. Hope you read the book and enjoy it.